Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strange, harsh, and often desperate ways medieval peasants survived the freezing grip of winter. Imagine this: the world outside your door is nothing but biting cold, snow piling up around the edges of your home, and daylight seems to disappear altogether, leaving you with endless nights. You'd be huddled up in a drafty, poorly insulated hut, likely with a few other families and animals crammed inside, trying to make it through until spring. And trust me, you probably won't survive this. Winter back then wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a constant battle for survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your neck of the woods. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The peasants of medieval Europe had to endure some of the most brutal winters imaginable. The frigid cold didn't just kill crops or make roads impassable, it could freeze entire villages in place. While we sit in our warm homes now, snuggled up in thick sweaters and sipping hot drinks, medieval peasants had to get really creative to make it through these bone-chilling months. And let me tell you, if you think you're tough for surviving a cold winter in your house now, you're not even in the same league. Picture yourself in a stone or wood cabin with no central heating, no double-glazed windows, and certainly no snow days to look forward to. These peasants had to depend on their wits and community to make it through. Historians still argue about just how bad winters were for these folks, but one thing's for sure: the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The medieval winter wasn't just cold, it was unforgiving. When snow began to fall, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a sign of months of hardship ahead. Families huddled inside small, poorly insulated homes made of wood, mud, and thatch. No matter how much they tried to seal up cracks, the cold always found a way in. Their homes were dark and damp, and the temperature inside wasn't much warmer than outside. Fires were a luxury, and in many places, the firewood needed to keep warm was a rare and precious resource, often burned up too quickly. You'd likely find yourself shivering under several layers of clothing, praying for the warmth of the hearth, which barely seemed to touch the frigid air. Still, there were ways that peasants tried to manage, even thrive, during this chilling season. It wasn't just about survival, it was about keeping your head above water until the thaw came. Historians still argue whether medieval people were simply resigned to the harsh winter, or if they had figured out a system that allowed them to thrive within it. Let's look at how they did it. Now that we've set the scene, let's look at the first big task for these peasants: creating shelter. Picture this: you and your family all crammed into a small, drafty home made of wood, mud, and thatch. The wind is howling outside, and the temperature is so low that even your breath hangs in the air like mist. But the shelter you have isn't just a roof over your head. It's the key to surviving the long months ahead. Building a home that could keep in the warmth was an art in itself, and medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of modern materials. They had to get creative. Most peasants lived in small cottages, which might have been nothing more than 1 or 2 rooms with a central hearth for cooking and warmth. The walls were made of whatever materials they could get their hands on: timber, straw, and sometimes mud. These materials were good enough to keep out some of the cold, but not all. It was a constant battle to make sure that the warmth of the fire inside didn't escape through the cracks in the walls. The roofs, thatch. Not the best insulation, but better than nothing. And, let's face it, better than a pile of leaves, although I'm sure that idea was probably considered at some point. You can say the homes of the medieval peasants were cozy, but in a way that makes you think about that cozy feeling of being squished under several blankets when the heater's on the fritz. There was nothing luxurious about it, just a desperate attempt to make sure everyone stayed warm enough to survive until the thaw came. And fire wasn't just a luxury. It was the tool for warmth and survival. Without it, the medieval winter would have been impossible. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Keeping warm didn't just involve the structure itself. The placement of the fire, the type of fuel, and the design of the hearth were all incredibly important. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood the art of passive heating, or if they just worked with whatever was available. Now, the process of building these homes wasn't done in a day. Peasants relied heavily on local materials: wood, stone, and clay. They'd often scrounge together anything they could find to make their homes a little more insulated. The smoke that billowed out from the hearths, not a problem in their eyes, just part of the process. But for us modern folk, smoke inhalation would probably have us running for fresh air in no time. Still, this smoky air was a necessary evil for survival. Then there was the roof. A thatched roof might sound quaint, but when you think about it, it's the perfect material for holding in the warmth from that tiny hearth. Of course, thatching wasn't foolproof. It leaked, it rotted, and it certainly didn't keep the weather out forever. Still, it was a whole lot better than nothing. The real trick for peasants then wasn't about luxury. It was about functionality. And with a bit of creativity, they managed to make their homes work during the freezing winter months. Historians still debate the exact techniques medieval peasants used to create warmth within their homes. Some think they had figured out primitive versions of modern insulation, while others argue that the cold was simply accepted as part of life. One thing we do know, though, is that these homes weren't built for comfort. They were built for survival. Once the shelter was set, the next major challenge for peasants was food preservation. Now, we all know how annoying it is to run out of food in the middle of winter, right? Well, imagine that happening every winter. No fast food delivery, no popping down to the store. For medieval peasants, the solution was to preserve whatever they could from the harvest, because when the cold hit, they'd need to make it last. And let's face it, with no refrigeration, the preservation techniques back then were a bit unconventional, to say the least. One of the most common methods for storing food during the winter was salting. Meats were often heavily salted or smoked to keep them from spoiling. This wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. Salt was expensive, but it could literally make the difference between life and death when it came to preserving the meat. If you had a pig, you were in good shape because that salted pork could feed your family for months. But it wasn't just about meats. Peasants also preserved vegetables, especially root crops like turnips and carrots. These could be stored in cool cellars or buried in the earth, where the ground's natural temperature kept them fresh. Potatoes and cabbages were also hardy enough to last through the cold. Historians still argue about just how much variety medieval peasants actually had in their winter diets. Some suggest it was all about the basics, while others point to the odd, rare treat like pickled herring. But preserving food wasn't always so simple. It's not like you could just slap some salt on a slab of meat and call it a day. The preservation process took time, effort, and a lot of trial and error. Most families had small smokehouses or curing rooms where they could hang their meats, sometimes for months, to ensure they were ready when hunger struck. And when the weather was particularly harsh, it was crucial to keep these spaces sealed tightly to keep animals away. The smell of smoked meat would have filled the air in these homes, letting everyone know that the food they had worked so hard to store was going to keep them alive for one more season. One strange tidbit about the medieval winter food supply: some peasants would use a technique called fermentation to preserve fruits and vegetables. This method wasn't just for the vegetables themselves. It also helped create drinks like fermented cider. Imagine sipping on some homemade cider in the middle of winter. A little bit of warmth from the inside to counteract the chill outside. Historians still debate how much alcohol peasants actually drank during the winter months. Some argue it was a daily necessity to survive the cold, while others think it might have been more of a rare luxury. Either way, fermentation was a handy tool. Despite all this, food preservation was never foolproof. The cold would sometimes find a way into the food stores, spoiling what was supposed to last through the harshest months. Mice, rats, and insects were constantly trying to get in on the food stash, so peasants had to be vigilant. And it wasn't just about food going bad. Spoiled food could lead to illness, and a sick peasant during winter was a serious problem. The lack of medical care meant that any illness could be a death sentence. So food wasn't just something to fill your stomach, it was a tool for survival. The debate still rages among historians about how successful these methods of preservation actually were. Some claim medieval peasants were surprisingly resourceful in storing their food, while others argue they were constantly struggling to keep up with spoilage and pests. One thing's for sure, though, when the cold came, it was all hands on deck to make sure the food supply lasted. And for many, food preservation was literally the difference between surviving the winter and not. With shelter and food squared away, another major lifeline for medieval peasants during winter was their livestock. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, sure, they had a few cows and chickens. But it wasn't just about having a couple of animals to help with the farm work in warmer months. During winter, animals became absolutely essential for survival. Not only were they a source of food, but their warmth could help heat a chilly hut too. The relationship between peasants and their livestock was symbiotic. These animals didn't just provide milk and meat, they were partners in making it through the freezing nights. First off, let's talk about the livestock themselves. The most important animals were the ones that could provide a steady supply of milk, eggs, and meat: cows, pigs, sheep, and poultry. But the real winners were the animals that could help keep the peasants warm. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep next to their animals during the coldest nights. The heat radiating off a warm cow or sheep could make a big difference in a freezing hut, where the air was so cold you could almost see your breath all day long. And don't even get me started on the sheer joy of having a pig or cow lying on your feet in the middle of the night. You'd probably trade your bed for that warmth, wouldn't you? But livestock wasn't just good for physical warmth. Their byproducts, like manure, were invaluable during winter as well. In many cases, peasants would store manure in a corner of the house, allowing it to ferment and produce heat over time. It sounds a bit unpleasant, right? But it was a practical way to keep things warm without burning precious firewood. Historians still debate how much livestock helped in terms of warmth. Some argue that the heat from the animals was enough to keep a room from freezing solid, while others claim it was just a small help in an otherwise unbearable situation. However, livestock wasn't all sunshine and warm fur. There were real risks associated with keeping animals inside the home. Disease could spread quickly among the animals, and they could also contribute to the spread of pests like fleas and lice. The close quarters meant that any illness that affected one animal could easily make its way into the human population. But even with these risks, the animals were essential. In many villages, it was common to see the livestock and humans sharing living spaces, creating a strange, often uncomfortable intimacy between the two. The debate about the role of animals in medieval homes is still ongoing. Did they really make a significant impact on warmth? Or were they just a necessary evil in the fight for survival? Some historians believe that livestock were vital, while others argue that their presence in homes was more symbolic of the harsh conditions, rather than a helpful addition. Regardless, the relationship between peasants and their animals was an integral part of winter survival. Without them, life would have been even more unbearable. The benefits of having livestock in your home weren't just limited to warmth. As I mentioned earlier, these animals were a primary source of food: milk, eggs, meat, and sometimes even wool if you had sheep. The importance of these animals can't be overstated, especially when you consider that they were the difference between eating and going hungry. In fact, many peasants would have considered their animals to be their most valuable possessions during the winter months. Firewood was the next critical resource, and it was, without a doubt, one of the most precious commodities during the medieval winter. You've heard of the phrase, "don't let the fire go out," right? Well, in medieval times, that wasn't just a catchy saying. It was a matter of life and death. Fire wasn't just for cooking, it was for warmth, light, and even protection. The fire in the hearth was the heart of the home, and without it, surviving the winter would have been nearly impossible. Finding firewood was no easy feat. The forests around medieval villages were often stripped bare by the demands of local populations. And don't think that firewood was just laying around, ready to be chopped and burned. For one, the forest was a dangerous place, full of wild animals, bandits, and, let's face it, the occasional witch or mythical creature. I mean, they're probably out there somewhere, right? But even beyond the dangers, there was the sheer effort required to gather enough wood to make it through the winter. People had to trek into the forests and gather wood, sometimes dragging it back for miles. This was especially tricky in the early months of winter when the trees were still bare, but the ground was frozen solid. It wasn't just about cutting down trees. It was about finding the right kind of wood that would burn slowly and keep you warm for hours. Oak was highly prized for its slow-burning properties, and many peasants would go to great lengths to collect it. However, not all wood was created equal. Pine and other softwoods burned quickly and created more smoke than heat. So, when firewood was in short supply, people often had to make do with what they had, burning anything from fallen branches to even small trees and shrubs. Interestingly, while firewood was essential for warmth, it wasn't exactly something that medieval peasants could take for granted. Firewood was a limited resource, and as winter wore on, it became harder to come by. The deeper into winter they went, the more precious that little pile of firewood became. Historians still argue whether firewood was considered public property in some medieval villages, or if it was a more private, fiercely protected commodity. Some villages even had strict rules about who could collect firewood and when, while others had communal wood-sharing systems. Imagine being forced to barter for firewood just to keep your family warm. It's one of those little aspects of medieval life that we tend to overlook, but firewood was truly a lifeline during the freezing months. Beyond just gathering the firewood, there was also the task of managing it. Peasants had to store their firewood in a way that kept it dry and easy to access. If it got wet, it wouldn't burn, and wet firewood is the kind of thing that can make you question your life choices, especially when it's your last bit of wood and the snow is falling outside. There were no indoor heating systems to save them, just a simple fire to keep them alive. So, managing firewood carefully was essential. Historians still argue about how well medieval peasants actually managed their firewood. Some think they were brilliant in their techniques, hiding stashes of wood in clever places or using techniques to dry out their firewood in advance, while others believe they were simply at the mercy of the elements, hoping for a little luck in the coming weeks. Interestingly, firewood was also used for more than just heating. People would cook their meals over it, boil water, and even use it to dry their clothes. Everything was interconnected, and the importance of firewood cannot be overstated. Without it, the cold, dark winter would have been far more unbearable. So, next time you're out chopping wood for a cozy fire, just remember, this was once the only way to survive the cold. Now, let's talk about one of the more interesting and downright quirky ways peasants tried to stay warm, their winter clothing. You might think that a thick, cozy coat would be the first thing on a medieval peasant's winter shopping list, but things weren't quite that simple. Clothing was often layered, pieced together, and patched over and over again. It was all about creating as much insulation as possible, and anything that could trap heat became a prized commodity. Peasants in the medieval period had a rather ingenious approach to layering their clothes, which was their way of mimicking the kind of warmth we now get from down jackets and thermal socks. First off, you'd start with the base layers, typically made of wool or linen. Wool, as you might know, is an excellent insulator, and it can retain warmth even when damp. Given how much snow and mud peasants had to contend with, wool was an essential material that helped keep them warm in the wet conditions. Linen was lighter and often used for undergarments or the layers closest to the skin. Wool would then be worn over the linen, and these layers worked together to trap air and keep the warmth close to the body. Historians still debate the exact way peasants constructed their clothing, but one theory is that they would have had a specific outfit for each stage of the day. For example, during the coldest mornings and nights, peasants would likely wear more layers of wool, maybe even adding furs or animal skins for extra protection against the biting chill. These layers were functional, not fashionable, and that's a key point here. What might seem like an uncomfortable, bulging mass of clothes was actually an important shield against the elements. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just about layering, it was about using every available resource to stay warm. For example, peasants didn't just wear wool and linen. They also made use of fur-lined cloaks, thick mittens, and woolen hats. And those hats? They were often designed with ear flaps to help protect against frostbite, a real concern for anyone living in medieval Europe during the winter. While we might think of hats as a fashion statement today, back then, they were a vital part of survival. You'd also find peasants wearing shoes or boots made from animal hides, which were great for keeping feet warm and relatively dry, although they did nothing to protect from the freezing mud that often surrounded homes. Historians often argue about whether peasants really understood the science behind their clothing. Did they know that layering wool would trap heat, or did they just layer out of necessity and experience? Some believe that medieval peasants, through trial and error, became expert survivalists when it came to fashioning their winter clothing. Others suggest they simply wore what they could afford, relying more on instinct than actual knowledge of thermal properties. Still, no matter how they put it together, medieval peasants were incredibly resourceful when it came to clothing. If you didn't have a warm cloak or the luxury of a big wool coat, you'd have to make do with what you had. And if that meant using old woolen sacks as makeshift outerwear, so be it. Anything that kept the cold out and the warmth in was considered a victory. As the cold settled in and the days grew shorter, light became another precious commodity. You might think that in an age before electricity, the nights would just be long stretches of darkness. And yes, they were, but the medieval peasant had one tool that made this more bearable: candles. But before you imagine cozy candlelit dinners and gentle flickering lights, let's take a step back and look at the reality of medieval lighting. Candles were made from tallow, which is a form of rendered animal fat. Not exactly the sweet-smelling candles we burn today, right? These tallow candles could fill a room with smoke and the scent of burning fat, and they didn't exactly last long. So, while they were incredibly useful in providing light during the long, dark evenings, they weren't always pleasant to use. Imagine being inside a cramped home with the smell of burning tallow in the air, the light flickering weakly in the corner as the cold wind howls outside. Not exactly a luxury, but in medieval Europe, that faint candlelight was often the only thing standing between a person and total darkness. Peasants didn't have the luxury of a constant supply of candles either. The process of making tallow was time-consuming and labor-intensive. You'd need to render the fat from animals, usually cows or sheep, which meant either slaughtering your own livestock or getting your hands on fat from a butcher. For those with access to animal fat, it was a relatively simple process. The fat was boiled down, strained, and then poured into molds to create candles. However, for the average peasant, candles were often a precious and scarce resource. Many households only had a few, which would be saved for the most important moments, like during meals or when people needed to work late into the evening. Interestingly, some peasants didn't rely solely on candles for light. In certain areas, They would use oil lamps made from animal fat, or they'd burn dried herbs, twigs, and other plant matter. These methods weren't as effective as candles, but they did provide a source of light in the dark winter months. In some places, people also used rushes, plants that grew in wetlands, which were soaked in animal fat to create makeshift candles. These rush lights didn't burn as brightly as the tallow candles, but they were often easier to make and more accessible. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval people used artificial light. Some believe that peasants would have spent the majority of their nights in darkness, perhaps just sitting around the fire, while others argue that even in the poorest homes, a bit of light was essential for basic tasks. There's evidence that some peasants could afford oil lamps or better quality candles, especially in areas where the production of candles was more widespread. Still, the question remains: did they rely more on natural light, or were they using candles to make life a little easier during the dark months? Candles weren't just practical tools, they were also sources of comfort. That small flicker of light could mean the difference between feeling hopelessly lost in the dark and having a slight sense of security in your tiny home. A light in the darkness, no matter how weak, gave peasants something to focus on during those long, cold nights. And while we might think of candles as a quaint, even romantic part of medieval life, they were, in fact, a crucial aspect of survival. A little light meant warmth, safety, and the ability to carry on with life, whether that meant reading, working, or simply waiting for the sun to rise again. As the days crawled through the bleak, cold winter months, one of the most important survival strategies was the tight-knit sense of community among peasants. There's a famous saying, "It takes a village to raise a child," and during the harsh winters of medieval Europe, that same village became the lifeline for everyone. While individual survival was difficult enough, communal survival became a shared responsibility. Peasants didn't face the frozen season alone. They banded together to share resources, help with daily tasks, and keep each other warm. The winter months were often filled with communal activities that not only helped with survival, but also gave the peasants a much-needed sense of solidarity. One of the most important of these activities was sharing food. In many villages, families would exchange goods, whether that was a barrel of salted pork, a bundle of firewood, or a few extra apples from a cellar. Sharing food wasn't just about generosity. It was a necessary form of social insurance. If one family had a poor harvest or lost their livestock to disease, the rest of the village would often step in to help. You'd probably find people popping in and out of each other's homes, offering a bit of bread, a piece of smoked meat, or a kind word to keep spirits up. Historians still argue about how organized these communal systems were, but it's clear that peasant survival during winter relied on cooperation and mutual aid. Another key form of community support was labor sharing. For example, there were often work groups or labor unions formed for specific tasks like chopping firewood, repairing homes, or tending to animals. These groups, sometimes formalized by local custom, would come together and share their resources and labor to get the necessary tasks done. This was especially critical during the winter, when the short days and harsh weather made it hard for individuals to manage everything on their own. If a man needed to cut wood for his family, but the snowstorm kept him from going out alone, the whole village might pitch in to get the task done. In return, his family would help with whatever else was needed, a mutual arrangement that benefited everyone. Then there were the shared hearths. These were communal fireplaces where people gathered to cook, share food, and, most importantly, stay warm. These hearths were usually centrally located in a village or within a larger home. They provided a place for everyone to meet, exchange news, and bond over shared meals. The hearth was where stories were told, songs were sung, and the cold, dark night was made more bearable by the warmth of others. In a way, The communal hearth was the heart of village life. It was where people connected and found strength in each other's company. Historians still argue whether communal hearths were a necessity in every village, or whether they existed more in larger settlements where resources could be pooled. But what is clear is that they offered more than just warmth. They gave peasants a place of refuge from the solitude of winter's isolation. Of course, the communal lifestyle didn't come without its challenges. With so many people sharing such close quarters, tensions could rise, and disagreements were inevitable. Still, the need for survival often outweighed personal squabbles. After all, if your neighbor had a warm fire and some extra food, you'd swallow your pride and make nice. This sort of communal cooperation was essential during winter, because when everyone is working toward the same goal, surviving until spring, the individual needs were often set aside for the greater good of the community. Historians debate the exact nature of medieval village cooperation. Some suggest that these shared responsibilities were formalized and structured by local laws or the church, while others argue that they were more spontaneous and based on goodwill. Regardless of the structure, it's clear that medieval peasants understood the importance of community. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and in many cases, that was enough to make it through the harshest winters. Finally, after the bitter months of winter, when the cold air had begun to lose its cruel grip, the peasants could look forward to the most eagerly awaited event of the year, the return of spring. The thawing of the earth was a welcome sign, bringing with it the promise of new growth, fresh food, and the end of the exhausting fight for survival that the winter had been. For medieval peasants, spring wasn't just about warmer weather. It marked the end of hardship and the beginning of a more hopeful, fruitful season. The first signs of spring were carefully watched for. As the frost began to melt, the ground softened, and the first green shoots appeared through the dirt. Peasants could finally start their spring planting. The soil, which had been frozen solid for months, now became fertile again, and peasants could begin sowing seeds for their crops that would sustain them through the coming year. This was a critical moment. If the weather was kind and the seeds took root, it would mean a plentiful harvest in the fall. If not, the struggle to make it through the next winter would begin all over again. Spring planting was a time of hope, but it was also a time of risk. But the end of winter wasn't just about farming. It was about shedding the weight of survival. The long months of keeping warm with firewood, sharing food, and huddling close with family and animals were over, and life could start to feel a little less like an endless battle. The first spring rains, with their fresh, earthy smell, signaled a time for rejuvenation. The village would begin to buzz with activity as peasants went back to their farms, mended tools, and prepared for the months of hard work ahead. The dark days of winter had faded into memory, and now there was light, not just in the sky, but in the hearts of the people. However, spring also had its own set of challenges. After the long isolation of winter, the work of planting and cultivating crops was grueling. There was no break from labor, as the spring weather quickly transitioned into the sweltering heat of summer. The arrival of spring wasn't a complete relief. It marked the start of a new cycle of hard work and uncertainty. Historians argue about how much the arrival of spring really meant to the peasants. Some see it as the end of one hardship, while others suggest it was just the beginning of another, more demanding one. What is clear, though, is that spring was always greeted with a mix of excitement and fear. A fresh start, but a fresh start fraught with the risks of another growing season. But no matter the hardships, spring represented hope. The peasants could finally step out of the shadows of winter into the sunlight, ready to face another season of uncertainty. As the days grew longer, so too did their sense of possibility. They could finally look forward to fresh vegetables, early fruits, and the promise of better weather that would help them grow the food they needed to survive the next winter. After months of enduring the harshest conditions imaginable, Spring's return was like a reward for all the struggles they had faced. And so, after surviving the harsh winter, the medieval peasants would start again. With the warmth of the sun on their backs, they would tend to the fields, mend their homes, and rest for a while before the inevitable demands of the next winter arrived. Historians still argue about how much hope and renewal the peasants truly felt, given the unpredictability of the seasons and their limited resources. But one thing is for certain. After the brutal winter months, the arrival of spring brought a sense of relief, a breath of fresh air, and a momentary respite from the hardship that had defined the long, dark months. As we close tonight's journey, remember that even in the bleakest winters, the promise of spring was always there, waiting. So, as you lie down to sleep, imagine the warmth of the sun on your face and the soft rustle of leaves as the season changes, just as it did for the peasants who endured those long winters. The cycle of life is endless, but it's always moving forward toward brighter days.